No, it was just the way things happened, you know. It started off I didn't write, they wrote, then I started to write.
Most people remember George Harrison as the quiet Beatle, gentle, spiritual, and the last man anyone would expect to carry a lifelong grudge. He stood beside Lennon, McCartney, and Starr as they created timeless legends like Yesterday, Let It Be, and Hey Jude. But behind that calm exterior was a man who suffered one of the deepest betrayals in Beatles history, a humiliation delivered not by an outsider, but by one of the very bandmates he trusted most. The wound cut so deeply that George carried it silently until the age of 58, when he finally revealed the truth and shattered everything the world thought it knew about him. To understand why this betrayal hurt with such force, we have to return to George's beginnings long before the stadiums, the fame, and the spotlight, to a cramped little house at 12, Arnold Grove, where the foundations of a future Beatle were quietly forming. Born on February 25, 1943, George grew up in a home so small and cold that winter air slipped through the walls and your breath hovered in front of you even indoors. The toilet was outside in the yard, the floors creaked with every step, yet inside lived a mother who sensed something unusual in her youngest child. Louise Harrison, known in the neighborhood for singing so loudly the windows rattled, developed a strange ritual during her pregnancy. Every Sunday she tuned into Radio India, letting the drifting hum of sitars and tablas float through the room. She believed those ancient sounds soothed the restless baby inside her, and years later, George admitted that those hypnotic tones stayed in his bones forever, a quiet whisper of destiny already pointing him toward the music that would define his life. George loved sketching little guitars in the margins of his school books, almost as if he were trying to draw himself out of the classroom walls that felt like a prison. School had no room for music, and certainly no room for a boy whose mind was on melodies instead of math. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. In 1956, while riding his bike down a quiet Liverpool street, George heard Heartbreak Hotel blasting from a house window. He stopped instantly, frozen in the middle of the road. That sound, Elvis's voice, raw and electric, hit him like a lightning bolt. In a neighborhood where nothing ever happened, it felt like someone had cracked open a door to a bigger world. At just 14, George begged his mother for a guitar. Louise, who barely had money for the week, scraped together £3.10, a small fortune for the Harrisons, and bought the cheapest guitar she could find. George practiced until his fingers bled, sanding down his cheap guitar just to make it playable. Lonnie Donegan's skiffle craze swept through Britain, and soon George formed his first group, the Rebels. Their rhythm was messy, their timing was off, but the joy was real. It was the first time he felt music was his. Then destiny stepped in again. On the school bus, George met a boy only slightly older but far more confident, Paul McCartney. Two kids on the same bus route, both obsessed with guitars. They leaned over the vinyl seats, exchanging chords, jokes, and secret dreams about standing on stages they couldn't yet imagine. Paul later said George felt like his baby brother, but back then they were just two Liverpool teenagers trying to play American rock and roll. In March 1958, Paul brought George to audition for John Lennon's band, the Quarrymen. John took one look and said, "He looks about 12. But Paul insisted George could play, and on a dimly lit bus, with only a street lamp outside glowing through the windows, George played the lead guitar part to Raunchy. John didn't say a word afterward, and that silence meant George was in. Three boys from Liverpool with cheap guitars and impossible dreams, unaware that ego, jealousy, bitterness, and betrayal would one day tear their brotherhood apart, and among those betrayals, none would cut George deeper than the one delivered by John Lennon, the man he had once idolized. When the Beatles reached the absolute peak of their fame, George's world inside the group quietly began to collapse. To fans they looked inseparable, but inside Abbey Road's Studio 2, George increasingly felt like the outsider, the extra Beatle. The tension began in the mid-1960s, right as George's songwriting finally started to bloom. He walked into the studio with If I Needed Someone, proud and hopeful, only for John to glance at it and dismissively mutter, "It's nothing." It wasn't feedback. It wasn't advice. It was a knife disguised as indifference, and for George, it was the first crack in a friendship he once believed was unbreakable. It wasn't feedback. It wasn't advice. It was dismissal, and George went home that night in complete silence, telling Pattie Boyd only one thing: John didn't even hear the song. From that moment on, every time George grew as a musician and as a man, John seemed to pull away, as if Harrison's evolution was something Lennon could not bear. When George immersed himself in meditation and Indian philosophy, John mocked him openly, sneering, "You and your gurus, it's just another trap." George never fought back, but Ringo later recalled that the look on his face was like someone had stabbed him in front of the entire room. The breaking point came during the Let It Be sessions. In the 2021 Get Back footage, George attempts to explain a guitar idea, only for John to ignore him completely, eyes fixed on nothing, as if he didn't exist. After several suffocating seconds, George finally let it spill out, "I'll play whatever you want, or I won't play at all." And when the Beatles finally split, that buried anger did not fade, it erupted. In 1973, during John's chaotic Lost weekend, the two met in a New York hotel, and what everyone expected to be a friendly reunion turned explosive. When John casually suggested they might play Madison Square Garden together, George snapped, standing up, face burning, and shouting, "Where were you when I needed you?" Without warning, he ripped John's glasses off his face and threw them to the floor. May Pang, John's girlfriend, later wrote, "John froze, completely paralyzed." It was the one moment in his life when John Lennon was genuinely afraid of George Harrison, the Quiet Beatle, finally unleashing a decade of silent pain, disrespect, and abandonment. Yet the deepest, most enduring wound came not from John, but from Paul McCartney. While the tension with John was loud and visible, George's struggle with Paul was quieter, colder, and far more suffocating. By the late 1960s, as Paul increasingly controlled the band's sound, George found his carefully crafted songs rearranged on the spot. Recording engineer Jeff Emmerich recalled Paul standing over George's shoulder, dictating exactly how to play, micromanaging him into the floor, leaving Harrison stifled and frustrated. Years later, in a rare admission during a 1974 interview, George revealed the truth he had long kept to himself: "Paul ruined me as a guitarist." George wasn't ruined technically, he was ruined emotionally. Paul's relentless criticism, constant direction, and ceaseless dismissal slowly corroded George's confidence from the inside out. The most painful example came during the Maxwell's Silver Hammer sessions. George hated the song, everyone did, yet Paul insisted on redoing it again and again. After days of endless takes, George muttered quietly to Ringo, "Why are we doing this?" Paul, overhearing him, snapped sharply, "Because it's my song." That icy tone, the implicit reminder of his place, stayed with George for life. But the real fracture happened in January 1969, on the second day of Let It Be. George confronted Paul about the way he kept dictating guitar parts, only to hear the familiar justification, "I'm trying to help you, George." George's reply was striking in its honesty, a moment Beatles historians later called the clearest window into his true feelings during the film. "It's nothing personal, just musical." But everyone who knew him understood that it was personal, deeply personal. To the very end, George carried a wound Paul never truly recognized, a wound carved by the heartbreak of a friendship that could never find its balance. By the late 1990s, George's final chapter had quietly begun, long before the public noticed anything was wrong. He had already battled throat cancer, then lung cancer, and finally faced a brain tumor that left him physically weakened, yet resolute in his determination to keep creating, to leave behind the music and the legacy that would forever define him. Even while enduring the grueling radiation treatments, George remained committed to his music, working tirelessly on the songs that would become Brainwashed. Donnie later recalled entering the room to find his father whispering melodies into a recorder, his voice too weak to project, yet the urgency and devotion in those quiet sessions spoke volumes. He was racing against time. As the last weeks of his life wore on, the pain intensified, and the doctor's expressions grew increasingly grave. George understood the reality without anyone needing to speak it aloud. He requested to be taken to Los Angeles, to a private home owned by Gavin de Becker, where he could spend his final days surrounded by Olivia and Donnie. The room was arranged with soft light, flowers, and the sound of devotional chanting that had accompanied him since 1966, not for show but to soothe him during the sharpest moments of suffering. As November 2001 drew to a close, his ability to speak waned, though visitors arrived in small, tender waves. Ravi Shankar sent messages of support, Tom Petty wept while holding the phone, and even Paul McCartney came to say goodbye. The meeting was emotional, awkward, and strangely intimate. On November 29, surrounded by Olivia and Donnie, George drifted into a quieter state, his breathing slowed, his eyes softened, and his family recited prayers from the Bhagavad Gita, the very words he had lived by for decades. A final whisper left his lips for those closest to him, and then his body finally gave way. What followed stunned even industry insiders. His ashes were taken to India and released into the Ganges and Yamuna rivers in a discreet ceremony arranged with immense care, the farewell George had always wanted, spiritual, simple, and deeply aligned with the beliefs that shaped his music. Yet his legacy did not end with his passing. It continues to grow stronger each year. From Here Comes the Sun to While My Guitar Gently Weeps, from All Things Must Pass to the concert for Bangladesh, and his 2 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductions, George Harrison transformed the Quiet Beatle into one of the most influential musicians of the 20th century. Even today, artists describe him in the same way his son does, a man who followed his own path, even when it hurt, guided by a vision that was entirely his own, leaving a musical and spiritual imprint that will endure for generations. George Harrison carried that pain longer than anyone ever realized, a quiet, simmering ache that shaped not only his music but the way he moved through life. The world saw the gentle Beatle, the spiritual seeker, the man who smiled through interviews and let his guitar sing when words failed. But beneath that calm exterior was a story of betrayal and heartbreak that George rarely, if ever, spoke aloud. He lived with the sting of being dismissed by the very people he loved and trusted most, the friends and bandmates who had once been like brothers, shaping the trajectory of his life. John Lennon's sharp words, Paul McCartney's relentless micromanagement, the subtle undermining that made him feel invisible in moments that should have belonged to him, all of it left a mark that never truly healed, even as he created some of the most beautiful, timeless music the world has ever known. And yet, George carried it with a quiet dignity, never letting bitterness define him, channeling the pain into art, devotion, and an unwavering commitment to follow his own path, no matter how lonely it sometimes felt. As fans, we often celebrate the music without realizing the human struggles behind it, the inner battles that accompany creativity, fame, and friendship. His story forces a question that is as personal as it is universal. What would we do in his place? Could we forgive the people who hurt us most, or would we carry that weight silently, letting it shape us in ways both destructive and profound? Harrison's life teaches that forgiveness is not always about reconciliation. Sometimes it is about peace, self-respect, and creating a legacy that transcends personal pain. Even in his final days, weakened by illness yet determined to continue creating, he exemplified resilience, spiritual devotion, and artistic integrity, leaving behind a body of work that is not only musically revolutionary but emotionally honest. Now, as we reflect on George Harrison's journey, from a boy in Liverpool enchanted by Elvis Presley to a Beatle who confronted betrayal head-on, to a man whose final acts were guided by love, devotion, and faith, we are reminded that the greatest victories often come not in applause or recognition, but in the quiet triumph of staying true to oneself despite the wounds inflicted by those we hold closest. So, what do you think? If you were in his place, faced with betrayal by the person who hurt you most, could you find it within yourself to forgive? Or would the pain linger like a shadow over every accomplishment, every relationship, every song? Share your thoughts below, and while you do, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories the history books never dared to tell, the hidden truths, the human stories behind the legends, and the lessons we can all carry forward from the lives of those who shaped our world.